Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. When looking at applications or examples for utilitarian moral theory, one of the areas that comes up quite often is business and workplace issues. And actually, if you were to look at business ethics texts or similar texts, you would often find discussions of utilitarianism as a moral theory, in part because it's an approach in thinking about moral matters that makes a lot of sense within these sort of contexts, because every time that you're dealing with these sort of issues, you have something usually that's fairly quantifiable and reflects or results in preferences or orderings made by various people, and you have a number of different people's interests or concerns or stakes, however you want to put it, that are in play and have to be balanced against each other. So this is a mode of moral analysis that I think is quite familiar, at least on an intuitive level, to many people involved in decisions about businesses or about workplaces in general. Now, just to review, when we're thinking about things in a utilitarian way, we're looking for maximizing pleasure or happiness, or however you want to put it. Bentham allows multiple ways to conceive of this. And we're aiming at minimizing pain, but we're looking at it overall. So we're not looking just at one single person, we're looking at the entire community of people affected. So like I put here, think about who is affected. And I've got this word holders there, and there is a long-standing discussion, particularly in business ethics, but in other sorts of workplace ethics too. So this would apply to HR, to nursing ethics, to all sorts of other applied ethics. There is a difference between the people who are stockholders, the people who own a concern, the people who are supposed to be, at least legally, the ones benefiting from it the most, and stakeholders, that is the wider penumbra of people who are affected by decisions made by business. And we're going to see that running through a utilitarian analysis of all these different types of issues or problems. So, it's often framed in terms of stockholders versus stakeholders, but Bentham would frame it actually in terms of a sort of narrow conception of what he calls beneficence, doing well to other people, and then a wider, expanded, more global understanding of beneficence. So, to recap, it's not just a matter of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain for the people involved in the company or in the workplace, let alone those who own the workplace or own the business or own the concern. It's about everybody who's potentially affected by it. Now, if it's potentially affected by it, of course, as opposed to definitely affected by it or certainly affected by it, you have to, if you're doing a utilitarian calculation, you have to weigh in that probability as lowering the amount of concern. So if there's like a 1% chance that somebody's going to be affected negatively or positively, you factor in that 1% when you're doing the calculations. So let's look at some of these issues. One of the issues that is unavoidable is thinking about the quality of the work environment. And this comprises a lot of different sub-issues. You could think, for example, about the safety of a work environment or the comfort of a work environment, just in terms of physical issues, not yet getting to anything psychological, although these will have psychological effects. So if you're an employer and or an office manager or somebody else who's responsible for the condition of a workplace. And you have some sort of decision-making power over the way that workplace is experienced by the people working there, or even coming in off the street and entering there. You would want to make it as pleasurable as possible and minimize the amounts of pains that could be encountered in it. So, think for example about things as simple as, do you paint regularly? Do you actually clean the place? Those would be issues from a utilitarian perspective, small issues, nothing quite so big as, say, is it an unsafe workplace or is it a safe workplace? If you're a utilitarian, you would want it to be as safe a workplace as possible, so long as the emphasis on safety does not impinge on other things, like actually getting things done or people enjoying themselves. Another issue that would come up in terms of quality of workplace environment would be any kind of discrimination. If you're a utilitarian, sometimes people will say, well, if you're a utilitarian, you can single out some people within a given area and treat them badly because you do so at their expense, but that expense pays off across the board for a lot of other people. Bentham, himself, if you read his works, he would not be that amenable to that, in part because there's other quantitatively measurable, negative payoffs to doing that sort of thing. So, think for example about telling off-color jokes or racist jokes or jokes that offend religious people's sensibilities, or putting up posters that irritate the non-believers in the workplace or things like that. I would think from a utilitarian perspective, Bentham would be against that sort of thing. In part because even though maybe you've got like one person who's particularly negatively affected by it, and a lot of other people get to join in on whatever it is that's going on, it creates a sense of imbalance. It creates a condition in which people feel themselves, and the feeling is a kind of pain, feel themselves to be not entirely at home. And certainly in our diverse society today, and the way that things are set up, doing that sort of thing would provoke all sorts of other conflict, which again would include other pains, although some people enjoy getting into conflict, don't they? Another thing that's very closely related to quality of work environment. In a lot of businesses, there's an emphasis on efficiency or productivity. And this is an interesting case to think about, because one of the reasons we've had such a jobless recovery over the last 3-4 years is in part a result of not only outsourcing things, which is a matter of efficiency, but workplaces have become more productive. And what productivity actually means is more work gets done by less people or an equal amount of people, so you don't need to hire new people to do that in order to boost production, right? You can boost production by hiring more hands to actually do things, or you can have processes become more effective, more efficient, more productive, and then the same amount of hands can get more done. And if all of your competitors are doing the same thing within that kind of environment where you actually do have to worry about the costs of labor, yeah, that can be a real issue. That can preclude doing that. Now again, you do have to think about this in terms of stakeholders rather than just stockholders. If it's just a matter of profitability, of raising the profit margin so as to benefit the stockholders a little bit more by squeezing the workers harder and harder and harder, Bentham would be against that, because there's a lot more workers than there are stockholders, and most likely the pain, the discomfort that they actually end up going through, the risk of, say, burnout or collapse or things along those lines, it greatly outweighs the marginal increase in utility, in happiness, and in pleasure for the stockholders. Even if you think about stockholders being distributed across a wide margin of people, because we do have a lot of people who actually do buy some stock. Now there's trade-offs to this. And if you think about the wider community, maybe Bentham would look at this in a very nuanced way. because the entire lifestyle that we currently enjoy, and we have been enjoying for quite a long time, where we're able to buy an awful lot of stuff fairly cheaply, is predicated on more and more efficient, productive, organized processes. That's why we can live a lifestyle that, even though it's not, great, in comparison to previous decades, let alone centuries, it's incredibly rich. Logistics itself and technology is also a part of this process. So Bentham would look at that and he would say, are you boosting the overall happiness? Even if you do have some people who are out of work, are the people who are out of work actually able to enjoy all sorts of benefits that ordinarily they wouldn't enjoy because of a system that stresses productivity? There's an argument to be made there. And again, I'm not trying to actually provide exhaustive cost-benefit analyses of these sorts of things. I'm just sort of suggesting lines by which you might kind of work these things out. Another interesting issue, this applies to a lot of products, particularly the more prestigious the products get. Cost of advertising, or PR, is built into a lot of products. You may not realize it, but when you're going to buy brand name items, you're paying in large part for the packaging, for the image development and enhancement and continuance that's going on. You're paying for them to give away free product over here to try to build a market. You're paying for them to subsidize things over here sometimes that don't actually benefit you. So the question, I guess, with that would be, from a utilitarian perspective, is that practice of building in all these sort of costs because of advertising and PR, is that okay from a utilitarian perspective? Now, that's an interesting question, and I think there's two things to think about with that. So one would be, just think about the product by itself. Most brand name products are not particularly great in comparison to a generic counterpart, which tends to be a lot cheaper. But the generic counterpart tends to look generic, right? It doesn't have a lot of image appeal. And so if you look at it just on that basis, this can of corn versus that can of corn that's coming from Green Giant, or from Roundy's is more of a generic one. Who else sells corn? Well, I'll just say that. Pour them both out. They look pretty much the same. You're going to get pretty much the same amount of pleasure out of eating them. Same thing would go for shampoo. Anything you could think of. Do you really need to buy gas at this station as opposed to that station? Although gas prices aren't changing that much. A lot of luxury goods, really, you're paying in large part for these sort of costs. And actually a lot of staple consumer goods you are too. Now, if you look at it just in terms of the physical product, it's kind of dumb from a Bentham utilitarian perspective, right? Do people actually enjoy buying the things that have the glossy covers and tie in with their hopes, dreams, fears, all their other affections that advertising appeals to? Do people enjoy drinking Bud because of the interesting commercials and stuff like that, or Coors, or pick any other sort of, and I'm going to offend some people in saying this, any sort of low-grade crap beer in doing so? Yeah, I think a lot of people actually do buy those sort of products in part because there's a secondary pleasure that's involved with that very advertisement or other forms of PR that have built a kind of mystique around the product. And if you're Bentham, well, that would factor into the pleasures and pains, wouldn't it? On the other hand, if they really screw up the advertising campaign, that could work against them in that respect too. Closely related to this, at least structurally, different pricing tiers. This is kind of an interesting sort of structural issue too. Think about airlines, for example. If you're flying coach, now it's no fun these days to fly coach, because they've cut a lot of frills along the way, right? To remain fairly profitable, even though some of them are actually in bankruptcy now and then. If you're flying coach, you may not realize this, but your flight is in part being subsidized by the people behind the curtains. So the people in business and in first class, they're paying a lot more for their seats, and they're getting some amenities that you're not getting. So, you know, you might have to wait for a pillow or pay for a pillow. They get it, you know, automatically supplied. You got to pay for your alcoholic drinks. They get them automatically supplied. If you actually look at what they're getting for their dollar amount, it's kind of a dumb trade-off on their part. They're not actually maximizing their pleasure. They are, however, whether they realize it or not, and whether you realize it or not, they are maximizing the pleasure across the plane, because they're paying for services that are, you know, really overpriced, is helping to subsidize the services, whatever they may be, in coach. So is it okay then to charge some people premiums? And you can think about this with, you know, in terms of hotels. You could think of this in terms of all sorts of other related topics and objects and things that we would purchase. Does it make sense to sort of distribute costs and benefits in such a way that a small amount of people overpay and it helps out a larger amount of people? From a utilitarian perspective, that's almost a no-brainer. That one actually works out quite well. Let's move on now to some, you know, more, I don't want to say substantive, because these are all substantive topics, but, you know, the sort of traditional ethics topics, like, say, whistleblowing, right? What is whistleblowing? It's when you've got some sort of practice or product that actually maybe poses a threat to some people or violates some people's rights, or, you know, something is going on that ought not be going on, and it's being covered up. It's not being reported either through the media or to the appropriate, you know, law enforcement agencies or to the regulatory agencies. And a whistleblower is the person who actually says, hey, this is going on over here, I'm going to reveal this to you. Do you have an obligation from a utilitarian perspective, if you see some sort of practice that's going on that is supposed to be reported and nobody else is reporting it and they know about it, do you have an obligation to report it? That's a good question. You would have to look at how many people are actually being affected. And Bentham, you know, one of the famous things that Bentham said, he called rights nonsense on stilts. Why did he call that? Why did he talk about it that way? Because in his view, a lot of times the needs of the entire community were being overlooked by people focusing on my individual rights over here, my individual rights. So I would think that Bentham might actually be inclined to say that there'd be some cases where you shouldn't blow the whistle. If only a few people are actually being negatively affected by it, and disclosure is not really going to bother too many people, then don't worry about it. If on the other hand there's a great threat that would actually put a lot of people's, you know, pleasures and pains into play, or actually are currently affecting people negatively, then you would actually have an obligation to blow the whistle from a utilitarian perspective. Another related topic that you could ask about, which I'm not going to go into, should we be protecting whistleblowers? Should we be encouraging whistleblowers? And that's a whole different can of worms right there. Closely related, unsafe products. Now, from a utilitarian perspective, unsafe products, again, pretty simple. They're going to be going against the greatest happiness principle, right? Because if it's an unsafe product and it's being widely promoted, widely produced, widely sold, then a lot of people's lives, perhaps, a lot of people's health, a lot of people's livelihoods, pick whatever you like, are being threatened, and you're not minimizing pain, you're actually producing a lot of pain, and you're probably interfering with a lot of people's pleasure as well. This is one of those classic cases where it's limited benevolence or beneficence really should not get in the way of universal or general beneficence. Now, one thing that you could think about, though, unsafe products, we generally think about that in terms of the consumer, right? The people who are actually buying the product. So don't buy, for example, really, a lot of things that come from China. You know, they've got a pretty bad track record for environmental and health checking, you know, and concerns and things like that. It's not a good idea to buy products that you think might be tainted, and it's not a good idea to be selling products that are tainted either. And people do this because they want to gain something in the process. There's two other holders who could be affected, though. One would be the workers themselves, what we call the supply chain, who are providing these things. So if you think about Apple, for example, Apple got themselves in trouble in part because it got revealed that some of these factories that the parts are being assembled in or are coming from are kind of unsafe. The products themselves are not, you know, unsafe. They're not blowing up in people's pockets when they have them. But the workers themselves, the people, you know, closer in on the supply end, are actually being negatively affected. The other thing would be unsafe, say, within the larger environment. And this could come about two ways. It could be the production process itself is unsafe because it produces, say, environmental contamination. Or it could be that the product that you're generating is unsafe, not necessarily for the consumer themselves, but for the other people in the community who are stuck with, you know, this person's products. Another thing to think about would be, and now we're changing speed quite a bit, applying rules and procedures very strictly. Once you have rules, you know, do you keep them in place and say, look, here's the rules, everyone's going to be on the same level? Or do you have some leniency, some discretion in them to allow for cases so that you might actually, you know, locally work things out so as to minimize pain and maximize pleasure? This is a real issue in terms of, say, housing, right? People have to live with each other. And we are still, you know, deep in a problem with, you know, overvalued real estate that then took a dive. People who were lent all sorts of money who probably really couldn't have qualified for that sort of money, in part because of predatory lending, in part because of, you know, foolish government interventions that were motivated by both political parties, just in different ways. A lot of different things going on there. Think about foreclosures, and actually think about mortgages in general, too. I remember years ago listening to a radio show, and this reflected my point of view as well, where this is just before the bubble burst. The radio show host was saying, man, you know, when I had to qualify for my mortgage, I had to jump through all these hoops because, you know, risk was being distributed through the system. I had to, you know, actually do all these sorts of things, and I was worried I wasn't going to get my mortgage, and I had to save so that I actually could put a down payment down. And look at all these other people that are being granted them just like, you know, like clockwork for some sort of, you know, economic or political reason. What's going on there? And he was very upset. And, you know, that being upset, that's a pain that needs to be thought of. What about the people whose lives are made easier by allowing them easy access to the funds that allowed them then to buy the houses? I guess for a short time, you know, so long as everything keeps going on pretty well, they're doing okay, and that actually maximizes pleasure for them. So maybe we should ease up on it. Now we're in the opposite condition, where it's worries about foreclosure. Should we foreclose on all these people's homes? Should we help them out? You know, should we use government money to fund efforts to get some people out from being, as they say, underwater? Or should we say, well, you made your bed, now you have to be responsible and lie in it? That would be something that we could do a cost-benefit analysis with from a utilitarian perspective. Two other things I want to talk about before we end. One is corrupt practices, and what we mean by corrupt practices would be, say, nepotism, bribery, you know, other forms of using influence to get ahead in business. Now, there are some cultures in which this is the norm, and it'd be interesting to think about what would Bentham actually say about that. In England, at least, in the places where that had become the norm, Bentham was totally against that because he said it subverts justice. And if you're subverting justice, you're actually producing pain for a lot of people because, although you're producing pleasure for the people who are able to get over, you're actually making a lot of other people ticked off because they're getting screwed in the process and they're not benefiting from this unjust arrangement that's going on. You could think about bribery, you could think about people able to sort of use the system, people drawing on influence connections and all that sort of stuff. I think from a utilitarian perspective, you can say that's actually a bad idea. A level playing field is probably the best idea. Finally, starting a business, I wanted to end on kind of a good note. Bentham actually was a typical laissez-faire liberal of his own time. He was a great admirer of Adam Smith, and I think that, we can see that even today small business owners are in large part generating rather than just sort of drawing on, sucking out things from the environment. They're the ones who tend to produce a lot of innovation, tend to provide a lot of the jobs available. And that would be, from a utilitarian perspective, a positive thing. If you're creating new jobs by finding some product niche that has not yet been worked in, and that product actually makes people happy, and you can do this feasibly, Bentham would say that's a good thing. Should we be encouraging small business, provided it's not doing stuff like engaging in corrupt practices or giving people crappy work environments? I think Bentham would say, yeah, we should actually be, if not promoting it, actively, at least getting out of the way and not making the business environment so onerous for it. And we probably should do a lot of watching out so that the big, giant corporations don't crush the smaller corporations and push them out. Bentham, I think, would be a great fan of small business. So that's where I'll leave off. A lot of different examples of business, workplace issues that utilitarianism figures into, and hopefully this has helped you better understand utilitarian moral theory.